resolved, yeah. Okay, good morning and welcome to the 21st meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. Welcome back everyone, those old and new to the committee. We've got apologies today from our convener Colette Stevenson, who can't be with us this morning. And we move to agenda item 1 on declaration of interest. I welcome all of you, of course. Welcome Alexander Stewart, Michael Mara and Carol Walken as new members of our committee. Thank you for joining us. I invite those who have not previously attended a committee meeting this session to declare any interest relevant to the work of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee. So let me start with Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Convener. I have no declaration of interest that would be referenced to this committee and look forward to being a member of it.
Thank you, Alexander. Good to have you on board. Michael Mara.
Nothing to declare, Deputy Convener.
Nothing to declare. It's always less than exciting when there's nothing to declare, but there we are. But I do understand that before we move on to the next agenda item, at this point, Jeremy Balfour may wish to make a short declaration.
Yeah, just to remind members that I am on AGP at the higher rate,
which I'm sure will become a relevant aspect later on in our evidence session. Thank you, Jeremy. We move to agenda item 2, decision on taking business in private. Our first item of business today, whether to item 4 in private. Are we all agreed to do that? Thank you, members. We now move to agenda item 3, evidence session, pre-budget scrutiny. Okay, so I now welcome to the meeting in the room Mary Spillage, Director at the Fraser of Alder Institute, and David Bell, Professor of Economics, University of Stirling. Welcome to you both. And can I welcome our witnesses online also, both from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, Tom Wernham, Senior Research Economist, and David Phillips, Associate Director from the Institute. So thank you both of you for joining us remotely to support our evidence session. And we will move straight to questions. Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I can't see the witnesses. Can they see us and hear us?
We've just told broadcasting.
Oh, there we go. Okay, great. Thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. Can I welcome you all and thank you very much for coming. And I wonder if I can start off by looking at next year's budget. What, from your perspective, are the main pressures on the Scottish Government in trying to balance its budget? And what role does Social Security play within that great scheme of things?
Okay. Well, my paper made it clear that my view is that the Scottish budget will be under severe pressure going forward into next year, and that has been highlighted both by Audit Scotland and by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and it's around choices that the Scottish Government are entirely within their powers to make, but the danger is that the various spending spending by the different departments is on track to possibly exceed the available budget, the available resource available through taxes and the block grant from Westminster. So that's partly driven by the social security budget. It's also partly driven by the health and social care budget, both of which are going to be growing in real terms, and it's also in a complicated way determined by the block grant which comes from the Westminster Government and the adjustments to that block grant that are made in relation to the various taxes that Scotland raises, but also in relation to its social security payments. And that block grant is there's going to be in effect a shortfall in terms of what Scotland receives for its contribution towards social security spending and the actual amount that is predicted to be spent, and that is a significant component of the pressure that faces the Scottish Government's budget next year, and indeed if present increases are maintained or if they are as the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts, that will be a continuing pressure on the budget.
Yeah, the Scottish Government set out many of these challenges in the medium-term financial strategy that was published just before Parliament finished for the summer. And the social security spending challenge is a clear part of this. So, as David says, social security spending is predicted to outstrip the block grant adjustment that's provided by the UK Government in recognition of these benefits now being devolved. And there are a number of reasons for that, which are about the sort of eligibility criteria in the process in Scotland, but also, of course, because we've introduced new devolved benefits there's no corresponding block grant adjustment with those. So those are the two main reasons that spending is outstripping the funding provided. But I suppose in the broader sense, it's not just about social security spending that are posing challenges to the budget. There were a number of assumptions that the government made in setting out what they thought their spending envelope would be compared to the funding they're likely to receive. Some of these are about pay, and that obviously nests within health and social care, local government and all of these other departments. Pay is a very large part of what the Scottish Government spends its resource funding on, over half of what it spends. And some of the assumptions that had been built in the medium-term financial strategy are about pay deals already decided, but many of those that have already been decided have outstripped the government's stated public sector pay policy already, and the government at the moment is assuming that those that aren't already settled will follow that. And given that most of them have bust through that already, that does seem like another risk potentially to pressure on the government's budget. The other thing that they've assumed, though, within departments is when you take sort of health and care out of it, which they're assuming will grow by around 4%, I think, in real terms over the next few years, and you take out pay and you take out social security, they're assuming that every other department remains flat in real terms, so there's no real terms cuts. And obviously within a fixed budget, if you're increasing lots of things by more than real terms, the government will need to make a decision to cut some things in real terms. And so that is part of the process as well. And what we've seen with medium-term financial strategies, when they have been published over the last few years, is to some extent they're managing expectations. They're saying there's not a lot of money to go around and we're going to need to make some tough decisions. But there will be areas that the government's going to have to cut in real terms if it wants to maintain health spending, social security spending and pay at the level that is already baked into its outlook.
Okay, we'll take some witnesses online, Jeremy.
Yes, I was going to say, I don't know if David wants to come in.
See, just before David does come in, a couple of mentions been made of the block grant, and of course we should explore that further, but just to note theme 5, we'll also explore that in a wee bit more detail. I know that Marie McNeil's got some questions on that at theme 5, just to make folk aware there will be opportunities to say more about that later. David Phillips.
Great, yeah. So I'd echo a lot of what Mary and David were saying there. I think it's also kind of worth bearing in mind that actually the last few years have seen quite significant increases in Scottish Government funding through that block grant that you just kind of mentioned there. But growth in that UK Government funding through the block grant is set to slow substantially over the next few years. So that slowdown in funding growth is one of the contributing factors to the pressures. And of course, that's taking place in the context of continuing rising demands and costs for several key services, such as health and social care. In part, that reflects the pay deals agreed, and obviously the Scottish Government has made choices to increase pay substantially above UK levels, potentially for legitimate reasons, but that does add to pressure on the budget. And also, of course, we know the health service in particular is struggling to regain pre-pandemic levels of productivity. The amount of treatments and sort of medicines and so on delivered for a given amount of funding is still below where it was before the pandemic. Other factors include, the need to find additional funding for the employer NICs increase on top of funding provided by the UK Government. Although we think actually that's perhaps more of a short-term pressure, and in the longer term, more of that increase in employer NICs will actually be reflected in lower wages rather than higher costs for public sector and private sector employers. And yes, as David and Mary said, a forecast increase in the net cost of social security spending on top of those block grant adjustments is also a factor in the pressures. And that's driven by a bigger increase in numbers in receipt of disability benefits due to those different eligibility and assessment rules. And also, obviously, the rollout of the two-child limit mitigation, which I guess we'll discuss in a bit, quite an effective policy for reducing child poverty, but that does add to that budgetary pressure. Now, as of the MTFS back in the summer, the medium-term financial strategy, it looked like combining all these factors, the slowdown in funding growth, the increases in social security spending, the actual amount for public services could fall in real terms. Even before thinking about what you spend on health, the total amount for public services could fall in real terms. Now, it doesn't look quite so bad at the current point. The tax revenue figures for a few years ago came better, so there'll be a bigger, what's called a reconciliation payment, a bigger top-up to the Scottish Government's budget next year to account for those past under forecasts. Revenues coming better than expected. And the planned cuts to personal independence payment in the rest of the UK are no longer going ahead. So that means Scotland will get a bit more through the block grant adjustments for social security. So perhaps not a real terms cut to public service spending needed in the next year, but very, very modest real terms increases, and health could easily absorb all of that and more. And I think much, how tricky it is next year will depend, as it has in the last few years actually, on whether the Scottish Government is able to carry forward funding from this year into next through the Scottish Reserve. It carried forward quite substantial amounts from 24-25 into this year. Can it again carry some money forward into the next year? But of course, carry money forward is not a game you can continue to play if the pressures are continuing to rise. At some point you will need to spend that, and that money can only be spent once. So there are a range of pressures in the budget. Social Security is one of them, but there are many others as well.
Thank you. If I can kind of focus in a bit more on the social security budget. In broad terms, if you were looking to make savings, you could either change the rules for eligibility or you can reduce the amount of money the person gets. Do you think either of those are necessary in the next year to deliver the social security budget?
So it's all about choices by the Scottish Government. As you say, they have chosen over the last few years to increase the payment made on the Scottish Child Payment. They have set up an assessment and reassessment process for ADP, which is slightly different to the PIP process in the rest of the UK. They have chosen to introduce mitigations, as David's mentioned, to UK-level decisions, including the one that will be delivered next year on the two-child limit. So these are decisions that the Scottish Government have made, which kind of almost by design will mean that more is spent on social security than the funding provided. And these are all decisions, obviously, that the Scottish Government could change if it wished to in the future, and perhaps a new Scottish Government in the future may choose to do that. But it can meet the current forecasted social security payments if it wishes to, but it will have to cut services in other areas in order to do that. Now, the budget isn't fixed completely. Obviously, the block grant, which we'll go into more detail on later, is determined by what the UK Government is spending on devolved services, mostly in England, and sometimes in England and Wales. That's what determines that. The Scottish Government does have tax powers. It could raise more money through tax if it wished to. And there are very, very small amounts of borrowing powers, but mostly focused on capital. And they aren't large enough, really, to move the dial on any of this, particularly if you're looking at the outlook for capital spending, which is also quite tricky. So it can meet these payments if it wishes to, but it has to acknowledge that there's trade-offs here, and that in doing that, money will be cut from other services. And some of these services will also support people in different areas of life, perhaps people in poverty, people with children and so on. So there is a trade-off here in choosing to spend money on this. We're not going to spend money on other things.
Yeah, and taking up that last point that Mari made, I think we don't really understand yet why there has been such large increases in recent years in the number of claimants coming forward. And, because we don't fully understand that, there is an argument about, are there services that we should be boosting, which actually result in reduced numbers of claimants, but without any detriment to the people involved themselves, by offering them other opportunities, other ways to say, for example, access the labour market.
I think that's an excellent point, just to add. The understanding that we have about what's really going on here, the proportion of these people, the people who are coming forward for ADP, for example, that maybe didn't in the past, whether they're in work or not, we don't necessarily know that. What's really causing this and driving this, and therefore what policy solutions would help maybe deal with some of this issue. We don't really understand it, and part of that's due to labour market data being very poor at the moment. And some of it's about the data that we should be probably collecting from claimants to really understand what situation they're in. So, I mean, that's a real challenge, because it makes the policy prescription here quite difficult to identify.
I wonder if I can just develop that quickly. I'm conscious of time, so don't feel you've got to answer every question that I or others ask. But interestingly, the MS Society in their submission said universalism risks spreading resources too thinly. And nobody wants to talk about universalism because we think, everybody wants everything. But if you take, for example, ADP, there's no means testing for ADP, so someone like myself with a very good salary gets it, somebody who's got no other money gets it. Is this something we should be adding to the conversation to say, should all of these benefits be not means tested, or is that something that goes back to the 1980s?
Well, I guess it's what are the benefits for? And I guess the important distinction that we would always make between UC and the health elements of UC and something like PEP or ADP now in Scotland is that they are supposed to be for the additional costs of having a disability. Now, it's always good for us to have a conversation about whether that's still the right approach, whether it's really reflecting the additional cost of disability, given the wide range of conditions and so on that qualify, and all these sorts of things. But, it's not supposed to be about income support. It's supposed to be about reflecting additional costs, perhaps additional services you require to be able to work, these sorts of things. So if that's what it's for, then we need to be very clear that that's what it's for, as opposed to UC, which is about people on low incomes.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, David, just one quick point. I always, I think it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask. And I always wondered, because I was involved with free personal care from its inception, whether there's some kind of overlap between two forms of effectively universal benefit for people that need care, but also are receiving ADP. That I think is a point of interest that's never been fully explored. Sorry, David.
No worries. I was just going to say very briefly that I agree with more or less everything that's been said already. I don't think it's necessary to look at cuts to benefits, either in terms of benefit rates or eligibility, but it is a choice, and a choice that the Scottish Government has clearly prioritised, with further increases in benefits above the block bond adjustment in the coming year. I think it is worth pointing out, though, that the Scottish Government's fiscal sustainability delivery plan does mention a couple of areas where it thinks there potentially could be savings, or at least, possibility of making changes that could result in savings. It talks about looking at increasing the efficiency of administration and tackling fraud and error. But it also talks about looking at the assessments, the reassessments of ADP claimants, saying that at least so far the initial evidence is that fewer people are losing or seeing reduced award at reassessment than initially expected. The system is still bedding in. They're not sure why that is, but they will review that. And if changes are required to ensure it meets the kind of principles, which includes value for money and efficiency, that changes could be made there. So it has, if you like, left the door open for assessing at least part of the system for ADP. And we know across the UK, actually, as well as more claimants, there have also been more, if you like, successful extensions of claims over the last few years, which have also been one of the factors leading to higher caseloads and higher expenditure. And then just very briefly on universalism, the kind of arguments about this are kind of well rehearsed, you know, kind of targeting versus, you know, kind of avoiding stigma and boosting, you know, take up. It's interesting to note, again, not this year's MTFS, but the last MTFS, I think in 2023, the Scottish Government did again kind of highlight that traditionally we've adopted a universalist approach in Scotland. With budgets tighter, we'll need to be looking at that. So again, I think the Scottish Government has kept the door open to, you know, consider where universalism may no longer be the most cost-effective approach. Whether they're thinking about that in terms of disability benefits or other parts of the benefit system is less clear.
Okay. And then finally, just very briefly, on the fiscal sustainability deliver plan, sets out a cashable savings of around about £1 billion in the first year. Is this achievable? Is this one of these figures that have just been dreamt up on a Friday afternoon, or is it something that, with the right kind of effort, could be done? And what effect would that then have on both individuals, but also on the budget?
So it set out a number of things, but I would say that from reading the document, I'm not clear as to how all these things hang together and exactly how much money is sort of being targeted to be saved by when, and how they'll actually know and how they're going to go about it and how they're actually going to know if it's achieved. Some of it's about headcount reduction, some of it's about efficiency savings of back office functions. You know, I don't really understand what that term means, to be honest, because particularly if you're looking at a public service reform agenda, which is also what the government wants to do, you know, I am sceptical about whether you can cut this much from an operating budget without it impacting somehow on the services you're delivering, because otherwise what are people doing at the moment? So, I mean, it's not clear to me exactly how the actions in the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan will contribute towards savings that need to be made, will be monitored and tracked so that we know whether, you know, the government's being successful. Hopefully there'll be more information published about that, you know, alongside things like the spending review. But I think there's a long way to go for it to be clear how those things are going to add up to the savings that they need to make. But, you know, in the end, they must be within their budget, so they will be. That's the thing. No. They will be because they must be. But exactly how they're going to achieve that is not clear. And, you know, it will ultimately mean a change in the services that are delivered for people.
Yeah, echo all. Sorry.
Mix it up a little bit, because there's a tendency always to the people in the room first rather than people online.
Sorry, okay.
And that's my fault as convener. It's me that has to kind of manage that properly. I've not been doing it. Can we say David Phillips at this point? Sorry.
Okay.
Great. Oh, sorry, David. Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Mike was saying there. I think it is first worth recognising, though, that it is actually welcome the Scottish Government has put this document. There isn't actually a similar document by the UK Government, although they do have some information like this in the spending review. It references lots of ongoing and planned measures and somewhat vague ambitions related to improving efficiency and productivity, service reform, prevention, early intervention, prioritisation, actually deprioritising certain things, although it's obviously a lot quieter about the things that are deprioritised as opposed to the things that are prioritised. Mentioned, you know, workforce, the 0.5% EU workforce reduction, given likely increases in the NHS and social care workforce, that would mean much more than 0.5% reductions in other areas of the public sector, which could be challenging both operationally and in terms of if you like, labour market relations. It mentions 3% savings for the NHS boards, although it's not clear, is that a 3% per year saving, which is very, very ambitious, or a 3% saving in total over the 5 years, which is perhaps, you know, a little bit of a sort of lowball figure for what they should be looking to achieve, given we still haven't recovered the productivity from before the pandemic. And it actually makes quite a big deal of what it calls the Once for Scotland approach, which it says could sort of reduce duplication and enhanced economies of scale, basically designing kind of systems and approaches once for all of Scotland rather than having different local approaches. Now, that could perhaps boost efficiency and economies of scale, but you could lose some local knowledge and local differentiation of services if that is kind of pushed through too forcefully. But I agree with kind of Myri, whilst this is welcome and it's clear that there is thinking going on here and some of this has been put into the public domain, it is really difficult to assess from the information provided, whether the targets really are feasible next year and over the next 5 years. There's no breakdown by initiative or service, no links to evidence on the effectiveness of different interventions and experience from elsewhere. And I think it's also worth noting that the largest component of the savings, what it calls efficiency reform and revenue raising, where it counts, I think, 0.6 billion, £600 million next year. Well, that includes additional revenue as a saving. That's not really a saving in terms of spending, that is additional revenue. It's not quite clear where that would potentially come from in the coming year, given commitments on income tax, not to increase income tax further. One thing I'd highlight there is that one thing as a researcher we've sort of noted is that the Scottish Government actually charges quite a lot for data compared to governments in Wales and England. And one of the things, maybe this will come across perhaps a bit self-interested here, but I think it is of a broader public interest, but charging researchers to access data can sometimes lead to a reduction in the amount of research you get, and hence can impact on efficiency and learning going forwards. So I think there are lessons to learn from perhaps England and Wales, where kind of more open data means more research, which can then inform policy and inform efficiency improvements.
Before I take Mr Bell, I should point out the main recommendation we get from researchers at this committee is they recommend there should be more research. It tends to be the main recommendation we get. Yeah, yes. Yeah. David, did you want to
just very briefly then, I mean, what worries me about the adjustment plan essentially is that many of these adjustments will have to be made in quite short order. And having to make decisions in haste may result in regret later. For example, if effectively the reduction in staff count is just by not replacing people, who are the people that you're not replacing? Are they key to the organisation? That kind of issue. And going back to Mary's initial statement, pay and pay settlements, I think, or the remaining ones, will have to play a key role in determining whether the Scottish budget can be managed this next fiscal year.
Thank you. Now, can I say to members of the committee, I'm conscious that Karen Walken's got to leave early today, so I would rather than go to theme 2, could we go to theme 2, theme 3, just now, Carol, if you're ready for theme 3, kind of jumping in a bit here. Can we take
of course,
you out of that?
yeah, of course. Thank you very much. I'm interested to speak a little bit about the argument around social security being seen as preventative spend, and how we talk about that, and whether treating social security as preventative spend, helps us with our decision making in terms of the Scottish budget, and how we look or seek to make sure that we can do that. So I'd be interested to hear from Mary first, if you don't mind. I know you, your organisation had put some response in on this.
Yes, so the Scottish Government in its public service reform plan that published before the summer is obviously keen to talk about the transformative nature of preventative spends. If we identify things we can spend money on now to save money down the line, then it's going to potentially take pressure off public services, particularly in acute settings, and make our finances more sustainable. The idea, I suppose, that the Scottish Government would put forward is that in lifting people out of poverty, and this was some of the figures that they put into the report on the Public Service Reform Plan, means that, you know, we'll hopefully spend less on crisis services later, particularly in children's life, and you know, they'll have better outcomes, and therefore they're likely to be contributing more and leading more fulfilling lives over the course of their life course. Now, these are difficult areas for the government. You know, quite often early years interventions are going to see payoffs 15, 20, 25, 30 years in the future, and it can be obviously difficult for politicians to think in that long-term way. So I would say that some of the figures in the Public Service Reform Plan on the kind of the savings that are made by investing in poverty reduction measures are difficult. Some of this research is very tricky, and there isn't good information really available. You know, this is us calling for more research again. Sorry, convener. But you know, it's a very difficult area to really understand the kind of, I suppose, you know, in economic terms, the return on investment of these things. It isn't clear. There's not a, if we do this, then this will definitely happen. It is a very difficult area. But there does need to be a meaningful shift to prevention, particularly in the area of health. But in order to do that, we need to come out of siloed working and think, well, what are the things that really determine poorer outcomes on health? Is it about housing? You know, so it's not even spending in the health area or other interventions which are going to make the difference. And that's why the discussion about reductions in headcount, which are needed, I think, in the public sector, given the growth in it, but also this issue about back office functions. I mean, how are we really going to have the thinking and so on to come out of silos and think about where we need to spend money if this is the approach the government are taking? So it's very important to think about preventative measures to reduce other spending in the future and make our finances sustainable. But the really quantifying the return on investment you get is a very difficult area.
Yeah, I know Tom wants to come in.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just about to say.
Sorry,
can we go?
apologies.
Yeah. You're going to come on online?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of echo the sort of point that there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly if we're thinking about income redistribution and tackling income poverty, how much that will, you know, be preventative in terms of reducing some of these longer-term problems with employment or health or education. I mean, there's certainly no doubt that there are huge differences between richer and poorer families in terms of how well children do at school, their health when they grow up, and that sort of thing. But you know, richer and poorer families don't just differ in how much money they have; they differ in a whole range of other characteristics in terms of the parents' education, parents' health, household structure, how much time they spend with their children, on average, of course. And all of these things could be playing a role, and that makes it really difficult to disentangle precisely, you know, what factors are really going to shift the dial on some of these longer-term questions. It doesn't necessarily follow that giving these poor families just more cash as opposed to other kinds of support is going to be particularly effective. There is a sort of growing academic literature that's trying to get really rigorous causal answers to the question of how does, you know, giving more income boost children's longer-term outcomes. I think it's fair to say, you know, the average paper does suggest there is some kind of positive effect on, you know, different outcomes, education, and health and later employment, but there's a huge range in the estimates available, and some papers have no effect at all. And I think, yeah, some of the papers that use really big data and get really precise estimates, they find nothing going on, including a study from the US quite recently where they gave families randomly huge amounts of money proportionally to their income, and it made no difference to early education scores. So unfortunately, I think the key message is just, you know, it does have the potential to make a difference maybe, but we just don't know yet, and we don't know how big a difference that would be. If we want to boost things like early education attainment, there's evidence that other schemes such as, you know, Sure Start centres, as we had introduced in the 2000s, can produce really positive effects. So yes, definitely important to think about longer term effects of the social security system, but it's not very clear that income redistribution is the most efficient way to achieve those longer-term gains. Might be, might not be.
Actually, we have a paper coming out in about a month on this, but not yet for the public domain, unfortunately. Looking at the two-child limit in England.
Yes.
If I just echo as well, I think kind of from a different area, but colleagues previously have looked at kind of how spending on social care kind of potentially reduces demand for healthcare. And they did find an impact, but the impact in terms of, the financial effects of that on the NHS was really quite small. A £1 reduction in spending on social care for the over 65s led to about a 2 or 3p increase in spending on NHS. Now, if all you're thinking about is the return on investment for the government, that looks like a bad investment. But I think when you're doing things, whether it's providing social care or providing cash benefits for households, it's not just for that longer-term return or that saving for the government down the line. It is that you believe these are the right things to do and that these have value unto themselves. So I think that thinking about social security spending as preventative spend, there is some evidence that it can help with other outcomes, although as Tom and Mary were saying, the evidence is mixed and it's hard to get concrete answers. But I think we should also reflect that this is just something, if the government thinks this is something that we should do just because it's right, that is an important reason to spend all that money as well, not just because it can kind of tackle other problems.
Thank you for that. I'm interested, and maybe you could come to yourself, David, if you don't mind, just to think a little bit about this in terms of the Scottish budget, and have the government done enough working on this to make sure, if we go down this route, which we've argued, there's lots of reasons to do that, how we're going to make sure that works in terms of the budget.
So, again, I'm echoing what others have said, but the issue is pretty difficult to assess because, I'm thinking back to the Christie Commission, it's always been the case that it's difficult to be definitive about the effects of preventative spend because you're looking possibly for the enhancements, the improvements down the line, some years hence. And actually, I don't think there's enough discussion around this. There's clearly information requirements if you're to do that. And here I could commend the Scottish Government in the sense that it established what's called Growing Up in Scotland, which was a longitudinal study of young people started around 2000, and they followed them. So you can kind of see what's happening. But I haven't myself been keeping up to date with the research that's been done using that study. But that's the sort of thing, especially when there are changes which take place which allow you to identify causal influences, which can be extremely valuable in sort of making a plausible case for redirecting spending towards what is deemed to be a preventative approach rather than a frontline approach. So, I mean, I think we all know that this is where we should be discussing. There are resource requirements to be able to have that discussion intelligently. But I think, I suspect others would agree that that's where we need to go.
Thank you.
Elena, do you want to come in?
Yeah, briefly, Convener, thank you. I found this part of the conversation very fascinating this morning. And, early intervention and prevention is one of the key principles as to why I'm here in this place. That's something that drives me. But it's very interesting to hear Tom. And I think I'm quite interested to see this paper that's coming out with regards to England and the two-child limit. And I'm wondering whether there's actually a space for researchers to actually come out of the silo thinking as well, because if we only ask certain questions, we're only going to be looking at one part of it. So I'm thinking, in terms of the short-termism, how do you quantify it if you're looking at studies in the States that have thrown money at families, but then not given a lengthy period of time to actually perhaps see what is the outcome? or if they're not the wraparound services that we need to think about as well, like the Sure Start centres. I made good use of that when I was first a mum way back in the early 2000s. I think it's the both, isn't it? We can't just look at things in the short term with cash first approach without actually looking at everything coming out of the siloed approach. So I don't know if anybody, I'm just thinking off the cuff here, but I just feel as if you've introduced some really interesting concepts this morning that I think we really need to explore a little bit more. I don't know if anybody's got anything further to say.
I think you're right. And some of the research that we referred to in our response is looking quite mechanically at the impact of different policies on poverty rates, sort of in the immediacy. So obviously, if you give direct cash transfers to particular households, which lifts them above the poverty line, then that reduces the poverty rate. So, kind of by definition, that's what it does. But the question is, I suppose, in terms of thinking about the impact that has as an investment or preventative spend, is what does that mean about the outcomes of the children who are living in those households in the medium and long term, and what sort of impact does that have on them in the long term? So some of the other ways that we've looked at through commissions and work with JRF and other bodies to see what are the other things that reduce the poverty rate, are about what support could the government put in place potentially to raise the employment rate, particularly of women on low incomes, these sorts of things, which for each pound you spend don't have as much of a return as in terms of the poverty rate reduction. But it's what does that poverty rate reduction achieve? That's the point, isn't it? It's not just about reducing the poverty rate, it's about what does that mean and what does that say about the outcomes that children are going to have over the course of their lives. So that wider look is much more important, because obviously if this simplifies things, but if in order to pay for that direct cash transfer, a wraparound service which was previously there is then gone, what is the totality of the impact on that family and the outcomes? And in order to sort of follow them and really understand that, you do need better data and research to follow those people through. And a lot of this could and hopefully will be in the future achieved by linking data sets together that we know tell us something about the outcomes that people are seeing, whether it's about tax data or other social security data with DWP. Now, this is all complex because we now have two bodies delivering benefits in Scotland, but it's not beyond the wit of man, I think, to link these data sets together so that we really understand and follow these people through, so we can see what the impacts are of the totality of services that are provided to the household, not just the cash transfer. And just briefly, just very briefly, do you think that those data sets, do you think some of our local authorities have a lot of that information in terms of the returns that they submit and what's happening in the area in terms of the national performance framework, etc.? How do you think we can gather that data better that's not more onerous but takes account of the data we already have? I think there's a huge amount of data that government bodies already have, but the trouble is that it's siloed, that there's a view of legal gateways that mean that there's not an ability to link. Now, there is progress in all this, but I started working in the government 20 years ago, and it's much better now than it was then, although the landscape has also got much more complex. But the progress is way too slow, and it takes far too long for us to make I think politicians at all levels should be insisting that this data is made available and linked together as much as possible to bring these insights, because unless we get these insights, we can't design policy in these tight fiscal environments that are going to have the biggest impacts.
I would just add that it's more difficult to follow children through school and subsequently in Scotland than is the case in England, because there's not a unique number that kind of follows them through their journey, and that's really disappointing.
Lena, thank you. I don't know if you want to come back in, but Tom has been sitting quite patiently. I think you mentioned his research, or the imminent research to be published, as part of your question. So, Tom, do you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I'll just quickly, a lot of what I wanted to say has been said in terms of, we really need more administrative data to become available. The research we've got coming out is using linked health and education data from England, which is only newly available. That kind of thing is really valuable. We've not had it before. I don't disagree with the premise of the question that a lot of the research is very siloed and looking at specific outcomes. Unfortunately, that's because to answer a question really rigorously in terms of what's the cause of a particular policy on later outcomes, you do need, well, you either need an experiment, which is very rare, or you need policies designed in a very particular way which are amenable to good research, and that's also quite rare. So unfortunately, sometimes, yeah, we do the easy questions because we can do them convincingly and we know the answer we're giving is right. These longer term questions are much more difficult to answer well, but the more we have big data and high quality data available, that is going to make it easier to find opportunities to answer these questions rigorously in the longer term. And thinking about how the data is formatted as well, even some of the early evaluations on Sure Start, where they know the centres have done well, for example, they don't always know why they've done well because the data on what was going on in the Sure Start centres wasn't available. It was a very localised scheme, and that might have been part of its success. But there was no centralised data collection, so we then don't know what the local areas were doing that was so efficient and what wasn't. So more data collection, thinking how that data is formatted, a real push to make it available to researchers and even shared between governments and government departments will help a lot.
And it's on that kind of, when it comes to kind of like tracking the benefit system, the UK government has put together a new data set, which we're hoping to start working on soon, called RAPID, which I think links together taxes and benefits data. But of course, my understanding is it wouldn't include the Scottish government benefits currently there. So again, so the collaboration between Scotland and the UK government, you know, and also, you know, Scottish and, you know, Welsh government and Welsh UK government is really important to kind of make sure that we're getting that holistic picture that I think, you know, which is emphasised is so important.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Convener. We've all identified, and you've already indicated, that social security spending is forecast to increase faster than any other part of the Scottish budget. And, you know, we are looking at considerable sums of money. You know, at the moment it's about 6.7 billion, and by an increase of potentially 30% is being forecast within the decade, and that would take it up to, you know, 8.8. And that's a huge sum of funding. So my question really is this, you know, how problematic or how sustainable is that increase in that timescale? And if it is problematic, why? And if it's not problematic, why? David, thank you.
Just one point. I'll be brief. One of the it's partly a consequence of the ageing society. And so the demographics are in a way kicking in because disability, older age is associated strongly with greater disability. And that's something that we can't do very much about. And there is a consequence in terms of the working age population and a need to increase productivity if we are to generate the tax revenues that will at least partially, or the increase in tax revenues that will at least partially offset the increases in social security assistance.
Yeah, it's worth saying that while some of the reasons for the social security spend outstripping the block grant adjustment that's provided by the UK government are about policy choices, so the mitigations, the different approach and the new benefits are the three elements of that. The demographics of Scotland compared to the UK is also going to be a part of it. So if we hadn't departed on anything and everything was exactly the same, there would still be a pressure because we obviously start spending more per head in Scotland on some of these. So some of this is sort of baked into the initial addition on the block grant adjustment. But our demographics are also different. So we're going to have more pressure potentially given our population ageing, and also is sicker generally than the UK. So it depends on the trends on that and whether those things diverge more than had been in the case in the past. I mean, I suppose just to sort of underline, it's going to increase from around 13% of resource spends to sort of 14%. So it is increasing as a share of the overall budget. And there's a question here about whether that can continue to happen, as we go forward. but the Scottish Government can make choices to spend more money on this. Absolutely. It just means they have to spend less money on other things. And one of the things that that we all no doubt have said in our submissions to you is that this is a bit different from other forms of spending because it's demand-led. So that's fine. It's again a choice the government can make, but it just adds additional risks because once the kind of criteria are set and you know the legislation set, then people, if they meet the criteria, are entitled to the payment, and therefore it can be less predictable and you know than other forms of spend and more volatile. So it's an additional risk, I suppose, managing this type of expenditure as opposed to something like, say, an employability programme, where you can, if you wish, which we've seen in recent years, halfway through the year, cut back on the spending because you know you're worried about you know your overall budget. So it's a less flexible form of spending.
And Sandra, I apologise for cutting across you. Could we take David Phillips?
David, thank you.
Yeah, if I can come in briefly there. So again, I would sort of say there's two things that could be driving increases in spending here, right? So one is sort of like active policy choices, and there, you know, it's a case of, you know, prioritisation, and different governments, different parties will have different views on the prioritisation of social security spend, different types of social security spend versus other types of spending versus the level of taxation. But it's not necessarily a problem if a government wants to prioritise one area of spending over another, provided it makes the sort of necessary choices elsewhere in the budget. I think what is a problem, not just for Scotland, but for the UK as a whole, is this big and unexpected increase in disability benefit claimants over the last few years. We'll come on to this, I think, a bit later, perhaps, talking about kind of the reasons behind that. But, you know, if this were actually driven by a increase in disability that actually would be unparalleled anywhere else in the Western world. Colleagues at IFS have looked at the trends in claims for these benefits. Nowhere else in the world has seen anywhere near like this increase. If that was reflecting a genuine increase in disability in the UK and in Scotland compared to the rest of the world, that's not just an issue of the public finances. That's a sort of, you know, a issue for society as a whole. So I think we'll come on to this, but, you know, is there a problem here? Well, potentially yes, but I think it's more about understanding what is driving this increase in disability. And although, as Mairi said, the labour market statistics are a bit ropey at the moment, what looks like a fall in employment in the UK relative to other high-income countries as well, that to me is, you know, it has a fiscal implication, but it has a much bigger societal implication as well.
And following on from that, you know, the Scottish Government have set out its fiscal sustainability delivery plan as to where they want to consider. And we've talked about already this morning the short-term savings that are potentially going to be coming from that. But looking across the longer term, you know, it would be good to get a view from you as witnesses as to what you think is achievable, and can we achieve some of the 5-year savings that have been proposed or predicted to ensure that we can do that? Because I think that, as you already explained this morning, there's a real dilemma about where you go and what choices you make. The government have an opportunity and they can do things differently if they wish to do that. But that does have consequences on what they can do elsewhere and what other savings can be achieved to ensure that they can maintain and sustain the social security budget to the levels that we want to see it or they want to see it at. So it would be good to get a view on that from you.
Yeah, I think it was David Phillips who already mentioned about some of the commitments in the delivery plan. So the one that David flagged was the 3% health board spending. Now, perhaps I missed it, and you know, there was a lot of documentation published on that day, but you know, it's not clear whether that will be reinvested in health or if that's a saving from the health budget that is then going somewhere else. Or if it's going somewhere else in health, you know, how does this fit in with the overall envelope and growth in health spending? Is that saving, meaning that it won't grow that much? You know, so none of these things are clear to me. A headcount reduction target has been set, but there's no plan about how that's going to be delivered. As David says, if it's just salami slicing, how's it going to be delivered across public bodies? Then it's going to be an inefficient way to do it, and it's certainly not going to mean you're making sure resources are directed towards your priorities. How we do this in the era of no compulsory redundancies. You know, what's the actual workforce plan here to achieve that target? And also, I suppose if the government are saying they're going to take £1 billion out of operating expenditure, the government need to be upfront about what that's going to mean, you know, and the consequences of that, because that can't happen with no impact on anything. Because if it would, then I think we would all be asking how that can be the case. Excuse me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Mary has just said, and it's about putting the flesh on the plan. You know, at the moment it doesn't read like, well, this is exactly what we're going to do to achieve the savings that we need. Of course, the much less painful approach is to actually get the economy growing more rapidly. Absolutely. And increase tax revenues, and then you know,
pay for it.
Reduce social spending in a sense, because people are back in employment. But you know, that's we are where we are on that, and you know, the UK government, the Scottish Government are focused on enhancing productivity, although we haven't seen much in terms of gains recently.
And if I could very quickly kind of add something here, so I would echo this sort of lack of information about the long term as well as the kind of shorter term plans there. I'd also emphasise, though, I think there is uncertainty, a genuine uncertainty that this government in Scotland is facing, and governments across the world are facing, about how much and how quickly new technologies such as AI and so on will translate into productivity improvements, and how effective the public sector will be in harnessing those, given the types of services it provides, labour-intensive services, quite unionised labour markets, and so on. My advice would be that the Scottish Government needs to be ambitious on innovation. It needs to plan carefully for the impacts on workforce and industrial relations and service delivery models. Ambitious there, but when it comes to planning their public finances, I would say it needs to be much more cautious, given that it's much harder to sort of adjust plans later on if you've built in assumptions of big efficiency savings from these types of things than it is to actually release money if you can go further and faster on efficiency than you initially had sort of built into your plans.
Thank you.
Okay, can I just make a wee brief supplementary on that myself? Every time we do budget scrutiny, groups in the third sector and across the board say we must invest more, usually direct cash payments to meet child poverty targets, the statutory duties we have in this place. We've already heard today, I think, that if there's money to be spent, putting money in people's pockets is desirable, but there's other desirable aspects as well, such as Sure Start schemes, getting people back to work, supporting families. There's other ways to spend that cash other than a cash-first approach. I think Eleanor Whittam was talking about that also. Given Scotland's budget and the current social security spend at the moment, how realistic is it to go much further in terms of growing the direct spend and cash going direct to families and individuals in this country to meet our statutory child poverty targets? Is there much more scope within the budget to do much more?
I mean, you know, the government, again, does have choices here and could choose to spend more money on it. You know, the overall challenges that the resource budget is facing, including pay, are big. They're big challenges. And, you know, as David Phillips mentioned earlier, choices that the government have made about pay for public sector workers have now meant that the median public sector pay in Scotland is higher than the UK average. And that trend has been quite different in Scotland and from other parts of the UK. Now, that's a choice they've made, and in fact, I've heard Ivan McKee, for example, say, you know, we made this choice. We want to, you know, pay public sector workers more. But it means that every percentage point of further increase costs more than it did before. You know, all compounds into meaning a larger challenge. And obviously, the public sector workforce in Scotland is significantly larger as a proportion of overall employment. So there are a lot of challenges in the current outlook for the budget. So they could make the choice, but they would have to cut it from somewhere else. And I suppose from a policy appraisal point of view, if we're looking at this holistically for the outcomes for families and you know, for citizens in Scotland, I guess generally what we would want to do is to look at all of the evidence for different sorts of interventions and to think where is the best way to spend money to achieve the outcome we want to achieve. And that needs the government to be clear about what outcome it wants to achieve and the options that are in front of it to achieve those outcomes and look at it holistically, because spending money on something is going to have an impact, of course, but is it the best way to spend that money to achieve the outcome in the most efficient way so we get best value for money?
And can I check, I'll come to you in a wee second, Tom. Can I check, Mary, what does the research show, or what would you say if money became available? How do you believe it should be directed? Because you've spoken of policy appraisals, they would come to researchers, they come to analysts. You sit within that space, not you personally, but you know, the organisation sits within that space. Do you think it's desirable to direct more money into the pockets of those living in poverty, or invest in those wraparound services and supports should money be available?
The evidence is difficult on this, and I think it is really about the government being clear about the outcomes it's trying to achieve. As we've said in our response, if your focus is strictly on the percentage of people in poverty, you know, compared to things like childcare and other interventions, it's likely that the direct cash payments are going to be a cheaper way to achieve a percentage point reduction in poverty than some of these other interventions. But you know, we're not seeing that holistic picture potentially of services, and you know, different families or different households may have different views of the priorities they would have in terms of the services provided to them. So it's a difficult question to answer, and I think it's more of a kind of a policy question and what the outcomes that the government are trying to achieve.
David, I will take you in, but I did promise to take Tom in first. Tom.
Yeah, I suppose if we think narrowly about, you know, if we want to achieve income child poverty targets, it's not just about how much money you spend, it's also about how efficiently it's spent and is it targeting the right places. I mean, one simple example, which I think the Scottish Government has taken account of, is that obviously children in large families are much more likely to be in child poverty, and so thinking about mitigating the two-child limit is, for the purpose of reducing income poverty, going to be a particularly efficient way. Have the mechanisms they're using to you know, boost incomes for poorer children are becoming a little bit blunt and, you know, starting to introduce quite big cliff edges, and it may be because of administrative difficulties, but the fact that, you know, you've now got, if you are on universal credit, you can get Scottish child payment. Going forward, you might get two-child limit mitigation, but if you absolutely have £1 of eligibility for UC, but if you have no eligibility, you don't get any of those things, means that families who, you know, increase their earnings by just a little bit might lose £7,000 or £8,000 a year. And that's not only going to be increasingly inconvenient for those families, especially if they're navigating volatile incomes and so on, but it also just means clearly the system isn't being super efficient in who it allocates money to. If you've got two families with fairly similar earnings and one of them is getting £8,000 a year more from the state than the other, that's not the most efficient way to spend money. So I think if you are going to spend more money, or given that more money has already been spent, you need to think carefully about how that's designed and whether we can improve the targeting and means testing system that is in place.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And I appreciate you mentioning those cliff edge dangers, which is something I've been raising for quite a long time now. I know it's not what we're exploring today, but I think it's important that you put it on the record. David Bell.
Just add that I mean the potential cuts that may have to be made will extend beyond those that are potentially extend beyond those that are concerned with poverty reduction. They could include things that affect the transition to net zero, for example. They could affect things like, you know, the police service, prison service. Many of the services that we know are pretty much stretched at the minute. So essentially, I think it becomes political choice about, yes, we have priorities, but we also have to have levels of priority in order to make decisions. And lastly, I would just say that all of these are being made against a background where the UK's overall fiscal position is as parlous as it's been for decades. I suspect that I'm the only one in the room who will remember some of the difficult times that we went through in the 70s. But people are comparing the situation now with what was experienced then.
I won't ask colleagues, Mr Bell, who remembers that, but I'm certainly aware of it. Michael Mara made a supplementary, but we're moving to Mr Mara anyway, so we'll take Michael Mara at this point.
I'll just move on to that, Convener. So in response to the call for views, the committee had received, you won't be surprised, calls for changes to taxation to fund further growth in social security spending. What scope do you think do we have within the devolved taxes to fund that future growth?
Well, I mean, the largest tax, obviously, the Scottish Government could look to change to raise more revenue if it wished to, would be income tax. In the sorts of sums that we're talking about, whether it's the gaps that the Government presented at the MTFS or, you know, the gap between social security spending and what, you know, that's the only one in town, really, if you're talking about significant changes. The Scottish Government have said that they feel, the current Scottish Government, that they feel that the sort of divergence between Scottish and UK income tax is probably as far as they'd like to go right now, with, you know, higher earners in Scotland paying sort of significantly more in tax than they would south of the border, albeit those on lower incomes pay a little bit less. So it doesn't sound like the current government is looking at that. But obviously, to raise significant amounts of money, you can't just, if you did want to do it through income tax, you can't continually target those at the very top, where, you know, there are basically not enough people in Scotland to earn that much money to be able to target anymore, and they already are on particularly quite high tax rates anyway. And the increase from 47 to 48p for the very top earners really didn't raise any revenue, according to the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So, you know, one could ask why it was done. If you want to raise significant amounts of money through income tax, you really have to be coming down the income distribution to be hitting, you know, the chunk of people who are earning, you know, what would be more average wages to raise a lot of money. So there is the scope to do that. Obviously, that may also have other consequences. And the larger the divergence between Scotland and UK, the more there may be different sorts of behavioural impacts on that. But they're much less pronounced the further down the income distribution you go, where people just turn to earn income through PAYE and will pay the tax that they need to pay. But there are labour market effects potentially in terms of incentives for work and all that sort of thing to consider. I think some bodies in this space are probably calling for other forms of taxation, which is maybe what you're getting at as well, around things like wealth taxes, for example. This is a very difficult area to actually implement. There isn't really an example internationally of somewhere that's done this and raised significant amounts of revenue. There are examples, but they're quite often very narrow and don't raise very much revenue in the end. So, you know, there are possible solutions, but those are not solutions which are going to, you know, yield any revenue anytime soon, even if they're possible to implement.
By any time soon, what would you mean in terms of a time frame, do you think, for that kind of approach to be implemented?
Well, as someone who's done analysis on the tax system for many years, you know, it can be quite irritating to hear talk of you know, quite blue sky taxation when we haven't even been able to reform council tax in Scotland or the UK as a whole. You know, the valuations that are still in 1991, you know, can we not even revalue the property system so we could have a tax which is fair? Half of households are in the wrong band, probably. You know, so capital gains tax at the UK level has all sorts of issues which probably should be fixed, and that's before we get into things like stamp duty, which have strange incentives in the property system, and it's generally thought of as a bad tax. So So there are all sorts of issues with the UK tax system. I think putting on top a very untested and risky new form of taxation, when I'm not sure about how we would measure the tax base, how it would be implemented, and actually there's no certainty about the revenue it would raise. Lots of clever people have spent lots of time thinking about this in various research reports, and it's very difficult, and it certainly wouldn't be whether it would raise any money at all, I don't know, but it would certainly take years to implement, and beyond the time of this Parliament, I mean the UK Parliament to implement.
David Phillips.
Yeah, so I'm going to come in. I think Mary's made many of the points that I would have made, kind of a few small ones. I think on the income tax side, I think it's worth bearing in mind that actually the current sort of forecasts for the net tax revenue position, because they use SFC forecasts for Scottish revenues, but OBR forecasts for the block grant adjustment, that net position is probably overstated, if you like, in terms of the forecasts. There's risks to the downside. Now, I mentioned that was to say that, you know, inbuilt into the kind of current MTFS and probably inbuilt into the kind of forthcoming spending review is a perhaps slightly over-optimistic position for Scotland's revenues. So even to sort of like kind of reach the level of funding that is sort of built into the kind of current medium-term forecasts, you might be needing to look at tax rises in Scotland. The second point I'd sort of also echo is that I think traditionally in Scotland, when thinking about progressivity, the focus has been almost entirely on income tax, and the Scottish Government has done quite a lot to increase progressivity of income tax, and, you know, maybe kind of pushing the limits there a little bit, particularly at the very top, given the scale of behavioural responses. But it has vacillated on council tax, you know, for years and years now. There is this engagement apparently planned for later this year into next year. Hopefully that could unblock that. If it followed the approach in Wales, where the Welsh Government has said that revaluing and reforming council tax is not about raising revenues, it's about making the system more efficient and fairer by making it a sort of more progressive tax. Well, in the short term, that wouldn't raise more money to pay for services. But if you had a more progressive council tax, then perhaps the concerns about raising council tax that we have at the moment, given that it does actually have quite a high impact on lower and middle income households, well, those concerns would be perhaps less significant if council tax was a more progressive tax. So it could make it a sort of more usable tax in the longer term. And as Maggie said, it is possible actually to introduce new taxes through local tax powers. I think often people have said that wealth tax can be introduced through local tax powers, but, you know, as Maggie said, in general, wealth taxation, you know, is tricky to get right. More countries have been moving away from wealth taxation than have been moving towards wealth taxation, given the sort of behavioural effects it has. And actually, in countries where there's subnational variation in wealth tax, like Spain, you have seen, you know, a number of regions kind of reduce their tax rates down to zero in an effort to attract rich individuals. And the evidence suggests rich individuals do move to those areas with zero wealth taxes. So I think that could be a difficult route to go down. You know, how usable would it be for Scottish councils if they were concerned that having a wealth tax meant that many of the wealthier residents moved just over the border into suburbs that didn't charge those wealth taxes. So I think there is scope to think about taxation and how you can raise more through tax, but I think that's not kind of like there's no low-hanging fruit here. It's about thinking about how Scotland can think about the tax system as a whole and really getting a grip of property taxes, which are the area where Scottish Government has most powers, but has done least really to kind of make those fairer and more efficient, and potentially making them more suitable revenue raisers.
Thank you. David Bell, so the questions that we've been addressing this morning have mostly been about how do we plug, or partly I would say, most about how we plug the gap that SFC have identified between the current plans and the revenue. I think what the evidence or requests that the committee are seeing is for further growth on top of that, for additional spend within benefits, in part some of the evidence. I mean, do you think that's realistic?
I think it's difficult in the current situation because it requires some very tough political choices about what it is that you're going to restrict growth in in order to effect that increase in social security spend. I mean, I think some of these political choices will become quite acute.
But on the tax question in particular?
On the tax question, I think moving either the form of existing taxes or introducing new taxes is fraught with difficulty, and some of that is not fully anticipated. I agree completely that council tax, which we've talked about land value taxes for a long time, but not moved anywhere near them, are in a sense a form of wealth tax, but have the advantage that the land can't be moved. But the Scottish Government of different political complexions has over the years failed to do anything very significant on council tax. So it appears that the political barriers are such that making a significant move that would massively increase revenues to compensate for the increase in social security spending that we're envisaging would be very difficult.
And Professor Spowge said previously that the changes to the very top rate have produced negligible amounts of money, no real contribution. Really, the contribution comes from people earning between 40,000 and 50,000 through fiscal drag. So would the weight of, is that where you think the weight would fall of any projected tax increases to meet the future demand? And also, do you think that there would be, you've also mentioned the issue about needing to get growth in the economy, what would be the impact of those kind of additional taxation on that kind of band find in terms of the impact on growth?
Yes, I mean, to make significant increases in revenue, you would need to focus more on the medium and lower bands of income tax. Migration would be less probably of a problem, people leaving the country as a result of the higher bands. But as Mary said, you then get behavioural responses in the form of people dropping out or working fewer hours, which may reduce the revenue that you actually get. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is that not only is it difficult to measure the behavioural impacts on people who are already in Scotland, but having a reputation as a high tax area mitigates against having people moving into Scotland who might help grow the economy in all kinds of different ways.
May I just add quickly? I mean, that's a really important point on behavioural impacts. I think often people imagine folk, fleeing Scotland with their bags of money under their arms. It's not about that. It's about looking at over the period of time. All of the people who would have come to Scotland, are there just slightly fewer than would have come to Scotland? And it's these sorts of behavioural impacts and the sort of at the margins. Do people just work a little bit less or don't take that promotion or that overtime because of the tax? Those are the important things to consider. And fiscal drag here is a huge issue because people over the years, even if the tax rates stay exactly the same, if the threshold doesn't move with inflation, more and more people are coming into these higher rates and effectively getting a tax increase, even though it's less visible than the rates changing.
And very briefly, if you want to raise more revenues, even more importantly, your tax system is raising revenue, distributing it as efficiently as possible. And there's opportunities there within Scotland. As I said, at the moment, Scotland has a regressive council tax, has a more progressive income tax than the rest of the UK, and has a very high property transactions tax, which discourages moving and mobility. Actually, thinking about the tax system as a whole, whether we valued more progressive council tax, lower LBTT, perhaps even abolish LBTT, income tax could make some changes there. But thinking about the system as a whole would potentially allow you to raise more, redistribute more, and do it more efficiently. Thinking about these as individual levers you pull, rather than a system as a whole, holds Scotland back.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we're the Social Justice and Social Security Committee and not the Finance Committee or indeed any other theme committees would have to deal with reform in the services that they would scrutinise. But we need to make sure that these matters are taken forward competently and appropriately, so the budget is here for this demand-led budget that we want to protect in the social justice within this committee. But as interesting as it was, I can feel us drifting towards a Kenny Gibson-esque Finance Committee debate, and we are the Social Justice Committee. Elena, can you get us back on track slightly?
I will do, but just before I do that, I used to be a member of Evaluation Joint Board, and I would say if there was going to be a full-scale revaluation right across the country, there would need to be the resources that would go down to actually carry out that work. So I want to speak a little bit about the growth in disability benefit caseload and spending. Now, David Phillips, we've already kind of touched on that this morning. Several people have made mention of it, but I just want to revisit a little bit to get a little bit more evidence from yourselves. So with regards to what progress has been made in understanding the reasoning for the numbers increasing across the whole of the UK on disability benefits. And you mentioned it, David Phillips, and your contribution earlier, so I'm just wondering if you can expand on that, and also the look that you had about the rest of, you look comparatively across other countries, and you weren't seeing that same significant growth. I wonder if you can talk a little bit to that. Or Tom, if you want to talk to it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can take that. I think there's still a lot we don't know about the precise drivers. I think there's a lot of talk that increased mental health problems are playing a role, and that's often a cited part of the new claims. And the evidence of that is patchy. Unfortunately, with all the problems we've got with surveys at the moment, there's lots of disagreement. But there are some signs that there are increases in mental health problems, but probably not enough to explain everything. At the very severe end, we've also seen increases in rates of working age deaths in terms of suicide and drugs and alcohol, which are signs of very severe mental health problems. And that's a real sign that there is something real going on. But again, whether that's just a small part of the story or a big part of the story in terms of the wider mental health problems, we just don't know, unfortunately, yet. But yeah, it's true that in terms of comparing to other countries, then yeah, we've seen much faster rises. To some extent, that's taken us to a more comparable level to other developed countries in terms of the rates of people who are on disability benefits, so they're catching up, but that's not necessarily informative because, of course, we've all got different systems with different rules. So yeah, it could be a number of things. It could be rising real health problems. It could be increased diagnosis. It could be, increased self-reporting, people coming forward who always needed support but weren't before. Or it could be there could be a role to play in terms of system design. We've had, obviously, the Scottish ADP has a somewhat more accessible application system. HIP, the application system, has also become a little bit more accessible in terms of move to telephone assessments rather than in-person assessments in places. It's really difficult to disentangle all the effects that all these things are happening. There's lots of candidates, but we've got no clear answers, I'm afraid.
So there's no firm answers on kind of the sort of breakdown of these three factors. It's probably like there's a combination of factors involved. Some combination of genuine increases in ill health, particularly mental ill health. Some changes in kind of like self-reporting and medical diagnosis. Some changes in application and reassessment processes, and that all of these have come together at a particular time to drive this increase, which, as Tom said, is a much, much faster increase than any other country in the Western world, but which actually takes us from a sort of below average level of disability level and sort of health benefit level up to sort of more like the average. So sort of, a problem that many of the countries did have is now kind of emerging in the UK.
So I've written a paper with David Blanchflower and Alec Bryson on, it's essentially on it's not mental ill health, but ill-being. So it's people who are not severely mentally ill. But what the typical assumption was that people's well-being was at a high level when they were in their 20s, declined during 30s and 40s, and then rose again after people were age 50, so sort of U-shaped. And we found that in the last few years, it just increases steadily with age. In other words, the young are those who feel most mental ill health pressures. I'm not saying they're mentally ill, but mental ill health pressures. And this change has taken place quite quickly, and we have only observed it. We can't provide an explanation as to why this is the case, but it is quite a dramatic change, particularly for young women.
All right, and
it's across. Yeah. So it's across the Western world. There's a paper out just by colleagues at UCL and IFS, which shows that this is the UK, US, and I think quite a few other countries as well. This has been a huge change across the world.
Yeah, that was actually going to be the follow-up question I had. Was where was that looking at? So, was the paper that you produced on this ill health, and was that across the UK or did that?
So actually, it used quite a lot of Scottish evidence. Right. It used the Scottish Health Survey, but also a lot of UK evidence. So it was UK-based, including a disproportionately high share of Scottish evidence.
Yeah, and I think perhaps the rapid onset of this has caught everybody on the hop a little bit in terms of having adequate resourcing for that rise in ill mental health as opposed to being mentally unwell across the board.
Yeah, so what we're not sure and maybe need to do a little bit more work on, David Blanchflower's of the view that it actually started with the 2008 financial problems, but there's also a view that it has certainly been exacerbated since the pandemic.
So that feels a little bit intergenerational then, if it's young people now who have perhaps were just born or not yet born at that point in time. And Mary, you spoke earlier about actually not understanding that the data sets associated with that. So how many of those people who are perhaps now on ADP are in work as opposed to not in work or claiming other benefits. So how do we actually ensure that we have that fullest picture so that we can understand the trends in a fulsome way?
Yeah, I mean, some of the difficulties have been caused by the well-documented issues with the Labour Force Survey and the Annual Population Survey, particularly during the years of 2022 and 2023, when we were emerging from the pandemic, and we would normally use the LFS and the Annual Population Survey to look at things like reasons for inactivity, whether people who are inactive wanted to work. But there's also questions in there that David analysed in his submission about the type of, if you do have ill health, if you are ill or you have a disability, what sort of condition is it, for us to be able to see how that's changed. So we are a little bit blind here to understand the sort of underlying prevalence in the population, although obviously self-reporting through a survey is not the same as being assessed and being eligible for a payment. They aren't the same thing. But yes, some of the data sets that are collected through for PIP and ADP, you don't necessarily know whether someone's working. On UC, there is a question which can indicate whether someone's in the readiness to work area. And interestingly, for UC in Scotland, it would suggest that the level of people who are claiming who aren't working is lower than before. It's sort of gone a U-shape a little bit, so it's come up a little bit in recent years, but it's lower than it was before the pandemic, which again is interesting. So we just don't really know whether all of the things that Tom's mentioned, how they're all contributing, and to what extent financial pressures in households have meant that people who had a condition are now more likely to claim when they maybe didn't before, because even if somebody's eligible for things, they don't necessarily claim them, so perhaps that's pushed that up. And to what extent more conditions have been recognised by people themselves that perhaps they already had or have been exacerbated through the pandemic. It's likely that all of these things are contributing, but we don't really know which ones are the main drivers. And as I said before, that makes it difficult in terms of, well, what's the policy solution to this? If it is about increasing mental ill health, then, obviously there are policy solutions to that which are very different to people being inactive because they don't have the right sorts of jobs or whatever. They're very different policy prescriptions, so we really do need to understand it. So more data collected from claimants would be good about their current status. Improvements that will happen, I think, in the data we have on the labour market. But more linkage of administrative data, as we said earlier, to be able to follow people through and to understand what's going on. And it will have to happen across DWP and Social Security Scotland, because folk are getting these different sorts of benefits, and we need to understand the full picture of folk in Scotland and what's happening.
All right, and convener, finally from me, I guess that there was, a £96 million lower spend in 24-25 on ADP than was anticipated, but that's not looking to be projected in the long term. That's set to rise. So that was just a little blip, I guess, in the reduction in the spend. I'm wondering, is there devolved policy decisions that are actually going to lead to that increasing spend? You already spoke previously about the review process maybe not giving the results that were perhaps anticipated, and that's been looked at again. Are there any other drivers in a devolved space that are perhaps going to lead to that increase in caseload and spend?
Yeah, I mean, these elements of demand-driven expenditure are forecasted by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and I'm sure they would say to you that this is not an exact science and it can be quite difficult. They don't only have to try and forecast the theoretical eligible population and how that might change, and as we've been talking about, it's changed in ways nobody expected, and so it might continue to do that. But also how take-up might change, and because we don't always know what the total eligible population is versus those who are claiming, understanding how and what ways take-up might change. I think there was an expectation that take-up in Scotland of ADP would be higher than its equivalent because of the different application process, which has been true to a certain extent, but maybe perhaps not as much as expected. The assessment processes are coming out differently. So I think whilst there's the forecasts, we have to recognise that they are quite uncertain, and that's why this area of spend is a little bit more risky, if you like, in terms of it's going to take up what it's going to take up in the budget, and the rest of the budget kind of needs to flex to go around it because it's demand driven.
Thank you.
I know Tom wants to come
in. It's still unclear, I think, exactly what the long-term consequences are going to be. I think since the introduction of ADB there was consistently higher applications for the last data we looked at. Well, that was only up to the middle of last year, but in terms of actually looking at the increase in recipients, there was an initial rapid increase, but then that subsided, perhaps because of people delaying their claims so they could be on ADP rather than the previous system. I think, in terms of changes to the application process and how that plays out, there's been a few papers suggesting that reducing the costs and barriers of applications to these sorts of benefits, perhaps unsurprisingly, can increase the rate at which people make claims and make successful claims. So these sorts of levers may be playing a role. It's going to be a longer effort to actually try and work out precisely what's going on there. But I think, making sure we have lots of information from the UK government and from the Scottish government about how the eligibility rules are being enforced, how the application process is actually proceeding, will help in people trying to actually understand these things. But sometimes it's not even very clear where there's been a change in how assessments are conducted on the PIP side, for example. That's not always very clear externally that that's even happening. So, I think lots of information going forward will help us understand.
And just to highlight, there's a kind of difficult trade-off here for governments to make in the design of disability benefits, because on the one hand, you want to make it as easy for those who are genuinely disabled to apply and receive the benefits they receive, but actually some barriers, some tests can be useful in terms of making sure those that don't need the benefits, those that aren't actually eligible, don't receive them. So kind of actually designing sort of eligibility systems so that you screen out those that shouldn't get that, but screen in and allow those that should get it to get them is quite difficult. And I think that actually, that's an area where Scottish Government has an opportunity to kind of learn by sort of innovating and trying different approaches. Now, that can be challenging when you're kind of putting some people through one system and some through another system, but actually small experiments to see how that affects things like take-up, how that affects things like fraud and problematic claimants, that can actually learn things for the long term about how you should design systems to make sure people that need support get it and those that don't.
You finished, yeah? Okay. And our final theme this morning, Minnie McNair.
Thanks, Convener. Mary, we're aware of the recent proposed changes to the UK social security policy and how that highlighted that social security block grant adjustments can change unexpectedly and at times with very little notice. You touched on it earlier on, but would you like to expand on on what ways and to what extent does this affect the Scottish Government's ability to plan and devolved social security policy? Again, you've touched on it and so has others, but anything else you'd want to highlight to the committee?
No, absolutely. And the announcements on the PIP changes that happened at the spring statement and the week before in the paper, and obviously there was slight tweaks between the two announcements, do highlight the very close interactions that the announcements by the UK Government on reserved issues for them, or sorry, devolved in England, can have on the Scottish spending envelope. And the PIP reductions that were planned over the next few years. Now, obviously, these weren't immediate, and they were going to come in, I think, in November 2026 when they were first announced, would have an effect because of a planned reduction in spending on PIP, would mean that the block grant adjustment to the Scottish Government would be reduced over the period of time. Now, there are other announcements at the spring statement which also meant... there were lots of other announcements, but that was one that could be isolated and shown the impact that was likely to have on the Scottish Government's spending power. So, for the Scottish Government at that point, and I suppose for the budget that was to come in December, it had a choice, looking at the impact that could potentially have on its budget for 26-27 and beyond, to somewhat follow suit with similar restrictions, to keep the system the same as it is now, and to have the funding coming through the block grant adjustment, or to fund the shortfall, which would be larger, through other parts of its budget. Now, this was the way that the fiscal framework was designed. There was always a need to, given the way it was designed, and the two Davids can talk about that much more than I can, I'm sure, in terms of the fiscal framework. For there to be a comparable payment or tax in England, or in England and Wales, or England and Northern Ireland, whatever the comparator was, to allow an appropriate either deduction or addition to be made to the block grant, because most people involved wanted to keep the Barnett determined block grant and adjust it to reflect these points of devolution. But this is the consequence of it, that an announcement can be made at the spring statement which would materially affect the funding available to the Scottish Government in the next budget year, and it would have to make decisions as a result. So it shows the close interaction. So these are devolved powers. And indeed, income tax is a devolved tax, mostly. But the decisions on PIP or an income tax for England materially affect the amount of resources that are available to the Scottish Government still, and may require a response. So it shows the kind of interaction and the very complicated system that might require a response from a devolved government, even though they haven't changed their devolved policy.
Thanks, that was helpful. I'll go to David online, then come back to David in the room.
Great, thanks. So following off what kind of Mary was saying there about kind of the sort of design of the fiscal framework and the BGAs, I wanted to kind of, I guess, if you like, first sort of defend them as a sort of principle and how they operate. And I think it's important to realise that the UK government raises the revenues to pay for social security spending in England and those BGAs. And if less is spent on social security benefits in the rest of the UK, that allows lower taxes or lower borrowing in general for kind of things that, benefit across the UK as a whole. And then if England and Wales and Northern Ireland were seeing lower benefit spending to pay for those lower taxes or lower borrowing, it would be unfair if Scotland managed to kind of maintain its high level of funding for benefits through that block grant adjustment. So, you need to have this block grant adjustment that responds to what's happening to whether that's, benefit spending in the rest of the UK for the benefit block grant adjustments, or taxes in the rest of the UK for the tax BGAs. That's a key part of making sure that Scotland doesn't, if you like, avoid contributing to UK-wide fiscal tightenings, but also doesn't lose out from UK-wide fiscal loosenings. It is a key part of it. Now, having said that, the fact that the Scottish Government has constrained revenue-raising powers and, very limited borrowing powers, even in the short term, means that it has less flexibility to respond to those sorts of changes in sort of UK fiscal stance than what the UK government does. So if the UK government cuts benefit spending in the rest of the UK, that means less block-on adjustment. The Scottish government really only has sort of, fairly limited options in the short term. It can do a bit on income tax, perhaps. It can't really borrow. A lot of the pressure comes in terms of public service spending. So I think kind of what this means is that, whilst the system is sort of working as intended, I think there is still kind of, more scope to give the Scottish Government more flexibility to respond to these issues, whether it's on changes on tax, changes on public service spending, or changes on social security spending, by giving it more fiscal flexibility. So I think there is still a case for kind of a wider basket of taxes to be considered for devolution, although, of course, that does then expose the Scottish Government to more fiscal risks, and also some, more sort of, so at least some modest additional borrowing powers to give it a bit more time to respond to changes, which, as Mary said, for PIP, were designed to be phased in over several years, but in principle could come in, pretty much immediately. So, yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to say. The BGA system is designed to work as it is, and that's an important part of the system, but it does create challenges for the Scottish Government, and I think there is scope to address some of those challenges by changes to other parts of the fiscal framework, like a bit more flexibility on other taxes, perhaps, and at least a bit more borrowing power to give more time to adapt.
Thank you. That was really helpful. David in the room.
I haven't got all that much more to add. I mean, David's right in that cuts in some UK programmes, even though they affect Scotland's BGA, could actually benefit Scotland's economy. So you cut some money out of social security, you put it into defence, and you increase defence spending up in Scotland by more than the BGA has gone down. I think the problem, all of these, it seems to me that the Scottish Government is flying blind on these issues because it doesn't have the information until very late in the day. So it's essentially another risk, and one perhaps that when we were thinking about the fiscal framework, we didn't perhaps fully think through. But the one obvious response is that the borrowing powers should be somewhat greater than they currently are in order to mitigate the risk that UK government policy suddenly changes, affects the BGA, and therefore the Scottish budget is materially affected in an unexpected way and with very short notice to make whatever adjustments that are deemed necessary.
Just to add, because I completely agree with David that this is the way it was designed to fulfil those principles of the Smith Commission, which are sometimes seen as conflicting about no detriment and policies in one area not impacting on the resources available in another, and so on. So all the issues of fairness that David talks about. But, so many years down the line and, the status quo that we have at the moment, for example, different income tax rates in Scotland and in England, it's not in the manifesto, of course, but if the UK government decided to increase income tax in England to deal with its current issues, that would significantly impact on the envelope available to the Scottish Government, because it would increase the deduction from the block grant significantly, and therefore restrict, the spending power of the Scottish Government. So, I mean, that's the way it's designed. That's what it's. But that's possible, and that is possible to happen. And it's about the notice, and it's about the ability of the Scottish Government to respond to that. But these are things that maybe folk who aren't close to the fiscal framework, like the three of us are, you know, might not realise would be a consequence of a significant change in income tax in England, for example.
Thank you. And obviously you were mentioning earlier on about the increase in taxes and, you know, folk not coming to England, but at the same time there's, you know, incentives like free tuition that people are coming to Scotland for. Is there any findings on that that you're looking at?
So there's been a few different research reports done by HMRC in conjunction with the Scottish Government, and we've been involved in kind of peer reviewing them and so on. And then there's lots of research like organisations like David's do on looking at some of these issues to try and get down into these behavioural impacts, particularly on income tax, to see what the differences might be. And the evidence hasn't quite caught up with the latest income tax changes that happened and the biggest differentials that now exist between. So more evidence will be required, more research is being done to try and... So there's some evidence that perhaps it's affecting the very highest earners, potentially. But, you know, we need to see more evidence and so on to see if it's actually impacting on, you know, people's decisions about how they come to Scotland. I will say, obviously, some of these issues which, if you talk to people in businesses or at different levels of income distribution, different stages of their life, obviously some of these policies are going to impact people at different stages of their life more than others, and particularly for younger people. They aren't always thinking about those sorts of policies if they're, you know, feel very far away from, say, owning a house or having children and so on. But you know, there's lots of research being done in this area to really try and understand what's happening, because a lot of the evidence current best evidence about the behavioural responses of different people in the income distribution, they're not specifically about Scotland in the UK in the current situation. So more research needs to be done so that we really understand what the impacts are.
Thanks, we'll look out for that.
And just really briefly on that, oh, sorry.
On you, David, yes, do you want to say something?
Yeah. Really briefly on that, what I'd add on that is that, yes, you're right that one needs to think about the overall package of Scottish Government policies. One needs to account for not just the higher taxes, but also the other sort of aspects of Scottish policy, whether that's free tuition or free personal care or so on. I think what I'd say, though, is that the free tuition was a sort of long-standing policy that was sort of like there in the background. What the recent change has been is those increases in taxes at the top. So, like, kind of, you know, holding the tuition fee policy kind of constant, one would expect, based on evidence from elsewhere, and to some extent evidence, you know, the emerging evidence in Scotland, for there to be a behavioural response, particularly at the very top of the distribution. But as Mary said, with the biggest changes not having come in place when that analysis that's already there took place, it's really important that that analysis takes account of what happened in 23 and 2024, and it's therefore good the Scottish Government has committed to doing that evaluation. It needs to follow through. Whoever is in government after the next election, they need to make sure that's done, because otherwise, you know, the next government's, you know, to some extent flying, not quite blind, but flying, you know, with one eye behind an eye patch when it comes to setting income tax policy.
Thanks, David. Back to yourself.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy, I am absolutely going to take you in. Time's almost upon us, but I am absolutely take you in on this. But if possible, could you make it brief?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my question is brief. Whether the answer is brief may be another issue. Because one thing we haven't touched on really is the 3 additional benefits that the government are going to planned introduction in this next fiscal year, particularly with 2-child limit, but also pension age, winter heating payment and additional person care payment. Now, that's political choices, and we as a parliament will make those, and there's moral decisions behind and all of that. But purely from a fiscal place, is this the right time to be introducing new benefits when, as we've heard for the last hour and 50 minutes nearly, there is so much uncertainty around the social security budget? So I'm not asking for a political decision or a moral view, but purely fiscally, is this the time to do it? And what are the dangers of that? And I appreciate the community wants a quick answer, but if that's possible.
Yeah, so overall, the cost's not huge, but at this time, I suspect, you know, we are perhaps close to the wire. So the question about whether these are affordable gains greater traction, perhaps. You can see the political case. You can see the case in sort of justice for this, but it is a difficult time to be introducing new benefits, or replacing existing benefits.
Yeah, the more of the budget that is dedicated to social security demand-driven payments, and the more that other areas are going to have to be cut, and the sorts of areas that are sort of left over when you account for health and social care, social security, and all these other things, are the sorts of budgets that have been under a lot of pressure for many years. So local government outside social care, police, prisons, all these sorts of areas. So a lot of these have been under pressure for a lot of, and actually the higher education sector as well, for many years. And we can all see, I think, strains in those areas of public service delivery. So, I mean, it does look like a difficult time to have further cuts in them to make these other choices. But there is a lot of evidence to say some stuff like investing in the making payment on the two-child limit, for example. We know that's going to have quite an impact probably on poverty rates. So that is a choice the government are making. But the other areas of service delivery that are going to have to be cut, are under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to kind of say that, this is, a time where we shouldn't be thinking about increases in benefit payments. As has been said already, there are kind of, trade-offs and priorities governments need to make. But echoing what has been said, this is a time, it's perhaps the most difficult few years of budgeting for the Scottish Government coming up. I think not only does it need to be kind of hard-nosed when thinking about which areas of social security spending it should invest in, but it should also be thinking about that across the budget. And, with higher spending, whether that's on higher education, on public sector pay, on free personal care, on social security benefits, given the tight fiscal situation, I think the Scottish Government, in its spending review, will need to be really, not identifying its priorities, but quite hard-nosed about what it's deprioritising as well. I'm not saying that should be social security spending at all. There's choices to be made, but, somewhere needs to be deprioritised. That hard decision is looming.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Jeremy, thank you. It was indeed brief answers as well, but very important answers. That concludes our evidence session. Can I thank both the witnesses in the room and online for your support and our pre-budget scrutiny. If there are any other reflections that you have, drop an email to the clerks. We're keen to consider it as part of our ongoing budget scrutiny. But thank you to all the witnesses this morning. That does conclude our public business for this morning. We move to agenda item 4, which will be in private session. Thank you.